Okay, so in this video, we're going to continue talking about the religions of India. In our previous video, we looked at the kind of traditional religion of India, which is Hinduism, and then how other religions emerged to challenge the social order that Hinduism created, namely the caste system. So in the last video, we looked at Hinduism and maybe the first challenger to the social order that Hinduism created, and that was Jainism. In this video, we're going to look at the more popular of these successors, and we're going to look at Buddhism. Now, when we look at Buddhism, you'll note that there is a lot of similarity between Buddhism's origin story and the origin story of Jainism. That's probably not coincidental. There probably was a lot of overlap between how these stories started. So, let's talk about the origins of Buddhism. So, just like with Jainism, this story starts with a sheltered nobleman. So there's a sheltered nobleman. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. And I am probably mispronouncing that, so apologies if I am mispronouncing it. So this sheltered nobleman named Siddhartha Gautama basically was a prisoner of his luxury. So he lived in a very fancy house with lots of servants. He wanted for nothing. He had everything he could want. He had lots of food. All of his things were taken care of for him. But like the founder of Jainism, he wanted to find spiritual enlightenment. He felt like the life that he was living was not fulfilling him. And so one day he escaped his, I guess, kind of sort of house arrest. And so he left. He left his home and started just walking to find what he was looking for. So he wanted to find spiritual enlightenment. And so he escaped and just started walking the earth. He started walking just to see what he could find. And according to Buddhist tradition, as he was walking, he found three men. He found three men as he was walking. The first man he found was an old man. And in his previous life, he had never encountered somebody who had become elderly. It was just, he was kept from all of life's problems. And so he had never found an old man and realized that, everyone will get old. And for someone who had never met an old man before, that was, I imagine, to be pretty shocking. And as he continued, he met a sick man. And eventually, and so, in his life, he, never saw anybody who was sick because those things were kept from him. And so he also realizes that everyone will become sick during their life. And then finally, he finds a dead man. And that is especially shocking because to Gautama, this had never occurred to him. And so he also realizes that everyone will die. And these are things that had been kept from him in his sheltered existence. And so now he finally realizes these things. And so he kind of groups all these things together and calls it suffering. And so what he decides to do then is to figure out, so his new goal is to figure out how to overcome suffering. And when I say overcome suffering, I don't mean that, how do we not get old? How do we not become sick? How do we not die? But more, how do we deal with these inevitable truths? How do we deal with these really unfortunate aspects of everyone's life? How do we do that? I mean, humans are kind of cursed by knowing this stuff. Every other animal is blissfully unaware of those things. So how do we as humans deal with these things? How do we deal with knowing that this is coming for every one of us? And so, again, according to Buddhist tradition, Gautama sat under a specific type of tree called a yew tree and meditated on this subject for 49 days. So for 49 days, Gautama sat under a tree and meditated on this subject for 49 days. And after 49 days, Gautama figured it out. So Gautama figured out the solution to this problem, and really the solution to the problem is the basic ideas of Buddhism. So the solution is what are called the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths. So the first one of these noble truths: life is suffering. That was the first thing that Gautama realized when he took his trip, his wandering. All of this stuff that he encountered, life is suffering. The next noble truth: desire causes suffering. Desire causes suffering. So if we think about this in a very broad way, wanting to live longer and not being able to makes you suffer. But it could be as simple as wanting food and not having food, and that causes suffering. Or wanting a new video game and not being able to get it, that causes suffering. So desire whether it's desiring to live long, feel better, have food, or simply want material things, that's what causes suffering. The next noble truth tells us how to get rid of suffering. So if we eliminate desire, that will lead to the elimination of suffering. So if we try not to want things or things that we cannot have, like we can't live forever. And if we can eliminate that desire to keep living, when eventually your life is over, you won't suffer. It's just natural. And the same thing goes for wanting a video game you can't have. If you can't have it right now, accept it. And you'll stop feeling bad about it. Now, of course, those things are a lot easier said than done. So that brings us to the fourth noble truth. To eliminate desire, you have to follow what's called the Noble Eightfold Path. And really, this is how you practice Buddhism. So there are 8 ways in which Buddhists practice their daily life in order to eliminate desire. And so I'll list them out here. You don't need to know them. But these are all the things that Buddhists would focus on in order to eliminate desire. So there is the right, and then there's going to be 8 things that you have to do the right way. So there's right belief, right resolve, that's like willpower, right speech, right behavior, right occupation, right effort, right contemplation, and right meditation. And according to Buddhism, if you do all of this stuff the right way, you will eliminate desire. And if some of this stuff sounds familiar, it's because this is often brought into a lot of popular culture. So this stuff is seen in Star Wars. This is the basic ideas of the Jedi. And if you don't do that, then you're a Sith, right? So the enemies of the Jedi are the people who don't do this. It's also how the airbenders in Avatar work. This is basically what the air culture was in the Avatar shows. So this sounds familiar because it's also made its way into a lot of popular culture. Now, again, because this is happening in India, if you do this the right way, you will reach nirvana, which is the Buddhist concept of nothingness. Basically, it's the same as ending the reincarnation cycle. So, Buddhists also believe in reincarnation, and if you do this the right way, you will stop being reincarnated and you will just be one with the universe again. Now, this religion, to put this back into the context of India, this becomes very popular. It becomes very popular for several reasons. One, like Jainism, it doesn't recognize the caste system. So like Jainism, it doesn't recognize the caste system. So if you are a lower caste person, you could become a Buddhist and you could be equal with other Buddhists. Another reason it becomes popular is that unlike Jainism, it's easier to follow. Remember, Jainists basically have to give up all the parts of life that would involve any kind of violence. Buddhism doesn't really go that far. It's easier than Jainism to follow. So it still requires the, I guess, sacrifice of material things, right? Because that causes desire. But it's not as extreme. So it's still something that requires a sacrifice, but it doesn't require that you give everything up to be a Jainist. Another reason it becomes popular is that it uses what are called vernacular languages. So this is a word that we're going to see frequently in this course. Vernacular. Vernacular languages are languages that regular people speak. So our vernacular language is English. The vernacular language of Germany is German. The vernacular language of Japan is Japanese. Religions, up until pretty modern times, used academic religions, or academic languages. So religions used academic languages that regular people couldn't speak. So, for instance, Hinduism used a language called Sanskrit. Which you had to learn as a second language. A more familiar example of this would be that the Catholic Church used Latin, which was a language that most people didn't speak. It was a dead language. You had to be trained in Latin. And so the fact that Buddhism uses vernacular languages makes it more accessible to people. Everybody can be involved in it. It's also important to note that because they use these vernacular languages, it also causes an increase in literacy. You have to be able to read to participate. A religion like Hinduism, you don't need to read because the priests just tell you what you need to know. Same thing with the Catholic Church. Most people didn't speak Latin, so you just had to take the priest's word for it. It also meant that you didn't need to know how to read. But once you start using these vernacular languages and expecting people to kind of participate on their own in religion, it requires people to learn how to read. Another reason that Buddhism becomes popular is that Buddhist temples act like, I guess the best way to think about them would be community centers. So Buddhist temples act like community centers. So Buddhist monks, people who lived at the temples, Buddhist monks survived on gifts from Buddhists in the community. And so they were given land and lots of food and other kinds of supplies as gifts. And so the Buddhist monks often shared this stuff with the community. So they also acted as like early banks. So you would give the Buddhist temple your money and they would hold on to it. And then if you needed it back, they would give you your money back. If you had excess land, you could give it to the Buddhist temple and they would give it to people to farm on and they would share in the food and the profits. So a lot of this stuff is talking about sharing with the community, and the Buddhist temples acted as a place where the poorest people could find food, they could find work on the land that the Buddhist monks were given as gifts. One other thing to note here, and we'll come back to this idea later, is that the people with the money were often lower caste. So the people who were rich in Indian society were often near the bottom of the social hierarchy. And so it makes sense that the people with the money would be attracted to Buddhism because Hinduism treated them worse. And so the Buddhists benefited from this fact. Now, there are a couple of other points that I want to make here. So these are just two last points. First, over time, Buddhism starts to look like other, I guess we'll call them monotheistic religions. So in the same way that Hinduism began to focus on particular gods, remember when we talked about devotional cults, Buddhism begins to treat Gautama like a god. He wasn't a god. In fact, the word Buddha, which was the title that Gautama received, Gautama means like teacher. He's teaching people a way to live. But over time, people started to treat Gautama like a god rather than as just a teacher. And so Buddhism starts to change, and it becomes a little easier for people to follow the words of a god rather than just a simple teacher. We also see another shift to make this look more like a monotheistic religion rather than a philosophy to prevent suffering. And that's the emergence of what are called bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are kind of like, so they're kind of similar to saints in the Catholic Church. These are people that achieved nirvana. So they had gotten out of all of this, but they chose to stay to help others do this. So over time, Buddhism starts to look like monotheistic religion. So there's a lot of overlap here between Buddhism and Christianity. And a lot of this overlap is happening through trade and cultural diffusion. So Christian merchants are meeting Buddhist merchants, and they're interacting, and they're changing each religion to kind of look like the other one. And when we talk about Christianity next week, we'll see how Buddhism starts to impact Christianity. But for right now, just trust me that it does. One other point I want to make, and I'm just going to add this up here. So one last point I want to make, I'm just going to add this up here. This is a short point, but Buddhism also had political support. So we're not going to go into this Indian empire, but one of the most important leaders, one of the most important Indian leaders who tried to unite India his name was Ashoka. So his name was Ashoka. He actively spread Buddhism through his laws. So he wanted people to become Buddhism through his laws, and he sent copies of his laws all over India. So Buddhism had a lot of things going for it. So it had political support, but it also had all these other reasons for its popularity too. It didn't recognize the caste system. It was easier to follow. Everybody could follow it and understand what it was talking about. And Buddhist temples acted like community centers. So they're actively helping the people who need help. So maybe you're not a Buddhist, but you definitely have a really good idea about who the Buddhists are, and you actively like them because they're helping you in your day to day life. So you're more likely to maybe convert to Buddhism. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So the next religion that we're going to start looking at are the religions of China. So we're going to do a little bit of background about China before we start talking about the philosophies that the Chinese are adhering to. But until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.